They say history repeats itself, first as tragedy, then as farce. But perhaps the cruelest truth is this: every civilization seems to walk willingly into its own decline, and almost no one notices until it's too late. At first, the decay is subtle, masked by prosperity, technology, and the illusion of progress. Buildings still stand, markets still bustle, art still dazzles. The people still believe they are at the height of their greatness. And yet, the seeds of collapse are already germinating quietly in the soil of the culture. It rarely begins with war, famine, or invasion. More often, it begins with a shift in the collective mind, a slow erosion of seriousness, wisdom, and depth, replaced by shallow spectacle, empty noise, and the reign of the lowest common denominator. Plato warned of this in the Republic, where he described how democracies, in their hunger for freedom and equality, eventually descend into chaos. And from that chaos, a strange kind of foolishness becomes the norm. Centuries later, Nietzsche saw the same pattern, calling it the herd morality, a flattening of thought, where the masses choose comfort over truth and popularity over excellence. This is the story of Rome, of Athens, of countless empires that rose with vision, then fell into mediocrity, not because they were conquered from the outside, but because they rotted from the inside. And here heads the frightening part. The pattern is not just political or historical, it's psychological. The same forces that drag civilizations into idiocracy can take root in your own mind, your own family, your own workplace. This isn't just about them in some distant past. It's stats about us, here and now. In this journey, we'll explore six deep insights drawn from philosophy, psychology, and history that reveal how great civilizations decline into idiocracy, why we fail to notice, and what we can do to resist the pull. These are not abstract lessons. They are living patterns you can see in headlines, in conversations, even in your own habits of thought. By the end, you may see your culture and yourself with unsettling clarity, and perhaps you'll know how to stand against the tide. It begins innocently enough. A leader, perhaps a statesman, an orator, a thinker, once devoted to hard truths, starts noticing the power of applause. The first time it happens, they might even feel uneasy, but then they realize something: applause brings influence. Influence brings power. And power, they tell themselves, can be used for good. This is the pivot point, the moment when wisdom begins to quietly lose ground to popularity. Aristotle, in his Politics, warned that democracy could easily slide into demagoguery, ruled by those who master the art of pleasing the masses rather than guiding them toward what is truly good. He saw that truth is often bitter medicine, and those who speak it risk losing the crowd's favor. Popularity, by contrast, is sweet and addictive. History gives us endless examples. In the final days of the Athenian democracy, political leaders learned to flatter citizens with promises of more freedom, more wealth, more comfort, all without the discipline or sacrifice that true greatness demands. Public debates became less about the pursuit of truth and more about rhetorical theater. Rome followed a similar path. The Senate, once a place of rigorous debate among patricians trained in philosophy and statecraft, became a stage for politicians who knew that a clever speech or a generous handout could win more loyalty than reasoned policy ever could. Bread and circuses replaced vision and virtue. The shift is subtle, because it wears the mask of democracy at work. Who could oppose leaders listening to the will of the people? But when the will of the people is shaped by the immediate pleasures of the moment, by spectacle, by fear, by easy promises, it can be led anywhere, even into decline. The philosopher Jose Ortega y Gasset described this as the revolt of the masses, in which public life is shaped not by the best minds, but by the loudest desires. The measure of a leader becomes not their moral compass or strategic foresight, but their ability to sense and reflect the crowd's emotions. And here's the psychological truth: popularity feels safer than wisdom. Wisdom asks for patience, for enduring discomfort, for facing facts that may unsettle our identities. Popularity, on the other hand, feels immediate, affirming, and unifying, at least on the surface. But it is a unity without depth, like a thin sheet of ice over deep, fractured waters. Today, the same pattern plays out in politics, media, even business. The metrics of likes, followers, and shares become a stand in for truth and quality. Leaders are rewarded for being seen rather than being right. In this environment, speaking an uncomfortable truth is not just risky, it can be career ending. The drift from wisdom to popularity is not simply a political danger, it is a personal one. If you lead a team, a family, or even your own life by chasing what is easiest or most liked, rather than what is right, you set in motion the same internal decay that destroys civilizations. So here sits the question worth carrying. When I make decisions, am I choosing what is right or what will make me liked? One builds a foundation that can weather storms. The other builds a stage that will eventually collapse under its own weight. If danger sharpens the mind, then safety for too long can make it dull. History shows that the virtues that build a civilization, discipline, courage, sacrifice, are forged in hardship. But when hardship fades, those same virtues often begin to decay. Comfort, once a hard won reward, becomes an expectation and then an addiction. Nietzsche warned of this in Thus Spoke Zarathustra when he described the last man, a future human who seeks only ease, safety, and pleasure, who avoids all risk and suffering, and in doing so loses the greatness of the human spirit. The last man says, "We have invented happiness, but it is a small, shallow happiness, stripped of depth and meaning." The Roman Empire's story is a textbook example. In its early days, Rome was a republic of farmers and soldiers, hardened by scarcity and constant threat. They valued discipline, disciplina, service, officium, and sacrifice for the greater good. But centuries of military dominance and economic expansion filled Rome with wealth, leisure, and luxury goods. The citizens, once willing to die for the Republic, now preferred comfort to duty. The hard virtues that built Rome were replaced by the soft pleasures that would help destroy it. The psychological mechanics of this trap are deceptively simple. Comfort lowers our tolerance for discomfort. Small inconveniences begin to feel like crises. We start arranging our lives to avoid anything that causes effort or unease. And yet, growth, whether for a person or a civilization, demands exactly the opposite: engagement with challenge. Even today, you can see the comfort trap at work. We live in climate controlled rooms, move at the touch of a button, and outsource most labor to machines. On the surface, this is progress, and in many ways it is. But the hidden cost is the erosion of resilience. When every friction is smoothed away, the muscles of the mind and will atrophy. Nietzsche's fear was not just that comfort would make us soft, but that it would make us small. A people obsessed with preserving their ease will avoid the great tasks, the uncomfortable questions, the dangerous dreams that require sacrifice, and so they shrink, not physically, but spiritually. This shrinking has political consequences. Leaders in a comfort driven culture know that the quickest way to gain favor is to promise more safety, more leisure, more insulation from risk. But when a society's highest goal is comfort, it will eventually surrender freedoms, truth, and even dignity to avoid discomfort. The trap is not that comfort is bad, it's that comfort becomes the measure of all things. When that happens, discomfort is mistaken for danger, and sacrifice is mistaken for oppression. The cultural immune system weakens, and the first true crisis can shatter the whole structure. For you and me, the warning is personal. Ask yourself, when was the last time you deliberately chose discomfort for the sake of growth? It might be as simple as having a hard conversation you've been avoiding, taking on a responsibility that scares you, or practicing a skill that frustrates you. Civilizations fall into idiocracy when their citizens lose the will to endure the discomforts that truth, excellence, and justice demand. Avoiding pain may feel like self care, but over time it becomes self erasure. So here is the quiet challenge: do not let your comfort grow larger than your courage. Every civilization has its thinkers, the guardians of wisdom, the architects of long term vision. They are rarely the loudest voices, but their influence shapes the invisible foundations of a culture, its laws, its education, its moral compass. When these thinkers disappear from public life, the decline has already begun. Cicero, in the waning days of the Roman Republic, lamented how philosophers, historians, and jurists had been replaced in politics by men skilled in little more than flattery and intrigue. He saw the intellectual class retreating into private circles, leaving governance to those who sought not truth, but personal gain. The Republic, once guided by minds trained in rhetoric, law, and moral philosophy, was now at the mercy of opportunists. Why does this happen? The answer is deceptively human. Intellectuals often grow weary of wrestling with a public that no longer values their work. They turn to academia, writing for each other rather than the public. Meanwhile, the public sphere fills with performers who know how to please rather than how to think. Plato feared this long before Cicero. In the Republic, he argued that philosopher kings would be the best rulers precisely because they would not want to rule. Their detachment from power, he believed, would keep them focused on justice and truth. But such rulers are rare, and when they vanish, they are rarely replaced by equals. Modern psychology offers another angle. The Dunning-Kruger effect shows that those with the least competence often overestimate their abilities, while the most competent underestimate theirs. In politics and leadership, this means the wise self select out of positions of influence, while the overconfident and often underqualified rush in. History suggests this is a turning point in cultural decline. Without intellectual elites to challenge, refine, and elevate public discourse, the tone of a civilization flattens. Conversations that once probed the deep questions about justice, beauty, the good life, shrink to slogans and partisan talking points. The public imagination grows smaller, its attention span shorter. In the late Roman Empire, this intellectual decay was masked for a time by the grandeur of its architecture and the spectacle of its games. But the Senate was no longer a place of rigorous debate. It had become a ceremonial body, rubber stamping decisions made elsewhere. Rome's mind had gone quiet, even as its noise grew louder. Today, we risk the same. Universities produce brilliant minds, but many are locked in silos of specialization, unable or unwilling to engage with the messy reality of public life. The thinkers we do have are often drowned out by entertainers and influencers whose currency is attention, not insight. The danger is not only that we lose our best minds, but that the public forgets how to recognize them. Once wisdom is indistinguishable from opinion and expertise from charisma, a civilization has lost its compass. For you and me, the lesson is personal and urgent. Seek out voices that make you think more deeply, not just feel more certain. Invite challenge, complexity, and rigor into your conversations. And if you have wisdom in your field, whether in science, art, philosophy, or life experience, resist the temptation to retreat entirely from the public square. Your silence leaves room for someone far less wise to fill the space. Because when a civilization loses its thinkers, it loses its future. The crowd is loud, and always has been. But in our age, the volume is unprecedented, not just in sound, but in reach. Every opinion can be amplified instantly. Every thought, no matter how shallow, can find an audience. And yet, the rare voice that speaks an uncomfortable truth is often drowned in the roar. Kierkegaard saw this danger in the 19th century, long before social media. In his writings, he warned against the public, not as a collection of individuals, but as a faceless force that shapes thought by sheer weight of numbers. In the crowd, responsibility dissolves. The individual, with their private conscience, disappears into the collective mood. He wrote, "The crowd is untruth, not because the majority is always wrong, but because the crowd encourages a way of thinking that avoids personal accountability. It becomes easier to agree with what everyone else is saying than to stand apart and risk the isolation of dissent." History is full of voices who warned of danger and were ignored, or worse. In 5th century Athens, the general Nicias cautioned against the Sicilian expedition, foreseeing disaster. The crowd dismissed him as timid. The result was one of Athens' greatest military defeats. In 1930s Europe, a handful of voices warned of the rise of authoritarian regimes, but their concerns were often drowned out by nationalism, economic distraction, and willful blindness. The psychology behind this is familiar. Humans are social creatures wired to seek belonging. Speaking against the crowd threatens that belonging, triggering fear and hesitation. Today, with algorithms feeding us the most popular, most shareable, and most emotionally charged content, the crowd's influence is magnified and dissent feels even riskier. This has a deadly effect on a civilization's ability to correct its course. Societies depend on outliers, the prophets, the whistleblowers, the stubborn skeptics, to point out the cracks in the foundation. But when the cultural atmosphere rewards conformity and punishes deviation, those voices go silent. Sometimes they stop speaking altogether. Kierkegaard's antidote was the reclamation of the individual. He urged people to withdraw, at least mentally, from the crowd long enough to hear their own conscience clearly. Only then can one speak with the kind of moral courage that resists the tide. This is not easy. It requires the inner strength to stand alone, to face ridicule, to persist when the numbers, votes, likes, followers, are against you. But civilizations only rise when enough individuals are willing to do exactly that. And here estas the uncomfortable personal question. When was the last time you stood apart from the crowd, not for rebellion's sake, but because your own sense of truth demanded it? Did you speak, or did you stay silent? The health of a culture depends on how often its people choose the harder of those two paths. So if the noise of the many feels deafening, remember, you don't have to shout over it. You only have to keep speaking clearly and consistently so that those searching for truth can find you in the static. One of the most chilling signs of a civilization in decline is not simply the loss of virtue, it is the celebration of vice as if it were virtue. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, reflecting on the moral collapse of Soviet society, described how people came to accept and even admire behavior that was once universally condemned. Lying, corruption, and betrayal were not only tolerated, they were rewarded. Truthfulness, compassion, and integrity were dismissed as naive or even dangerous. This is moral inversion, the turning of a culture's value compass until it points not north, but into a moral wilderness. We see this pattern throughout history. In the final years of the Roman Empire, political cunning was valued over honor. The ability to manipulate the Senate, deceive rivals, or stage spectacles to distract the people was celebrated as a mark of genius. Meanwhile, those who held to old Roman virtues, honesty, service, discipline, were considered impractical, out of touch, or even threats to stability. Why does this inversion happen? Part of the answer lies in the psychology of self preservation. When corruption becomes the norm, integrity becomes costly. Those who play by the rules find themselves outmatched by those who don't. Over time, people rationalize vice as a survival strategy. Everyone does it becomes the unspoken mantra, and soon the very language of morality is rewritten. Nietzsche hinted at this danger when he warned that societies could lose their noble virtues, the qualities that inspire strength, creativity, and honor, and replace them with values that serve mediocrity and herd conformity. In such a world, greatness is suspect and smallness is safe. Solzhenitsyn's insight was even sharper. Once a society begins to punish truth telling and reward deceit, it passes a psychological threshold. The population learns to distrust not only its leaders, but its own moral instincts. Good and evil blur into whatever works, and cynicism becomes the default state of mind. This moral fog is deadly to a civilization's ability to self correct. When vice is seen as cleverness, there is no shame to restrain it. When virtue is seen as weakness, there is no honor to pursue it. Leaders who would act with integrity are dismissed before they can gain influence, while the most ruthless rise unchallenged. Today, you can see signs of moral inversion in subtle ways. The glorification of greed as ambition, the framing of cruelty as strength, the dismissal of empathy as softness, the rebranding of manipulation as strategy. These shifts rarely happen overnight. They creep in gradually through media, politics, and daily conversation until they feel normal. And once normal, they are nearly invisible. The personal danger here is that moral inversion does not just happen out there in society, it can happen inside us. When you see dishonesty rewarded, you may feel the pull to play along just this once. When you watch people climb the ladder by cutting corners, you may feel the sting of being left behind. Over time, those compromises add up. The antidote begins with vigilance. Solzhenitsyn's own advice was deceptively simple: live not by lies. Even in a corrupt system, you can refuse to participate in falsehood. You can choose to speak truth, even if quietly, and you can refuse to mock or dismiss those who hold to their principles, even when the crowd does. Because once a society accepts moral inversion as the new normal, the fall is no longer a matter of if, but when. If you were to step into Rome during its final century, you might not guess it was in decline at all. The streets bustled, trade flowed, marble buildings gleamed in the sun, the Colosseum roared with games, the baths steamed with luxury, and the empire still proclaimed itself the greatest civilization the world had ever known. And yet, beneath that glittering surface, the foundations were rotting. This is the final and perhaps most deceptive stage of cultural decline, the illusion of progress. Civilizations are rarely most self congratulatory at their peak. Instead, they become loudest about their greatness when they sense, often unconsciously, that it is slipping away. The spectacles grow grander, the rhetoric more triumphant, the monuments more imposing. It is as if the culture is trying to convince itself that nothing is wrong. Historians note that late Rome was obsessed with public games, parades, and architectural projects. Emperors poured resources into building and entertainment. Even as the economy faltered, corruption flourished, and the military grew weaker. The grandeur served as a distraction, a kind of collective theater to mask the erosion of competence and virtue. Psychologically, this mirrors what individuals do when they feel insecure. They overcompensate. A leader who knows they've lost their people's trust doubles down on public displays of strength. A culture that feels its moral core weakening may increase its outward symbols of unity and success. The louder the celebration, the deeper the insecurity. The danger of this illusion is that it numbs the ability to respond to real problems. If everyone insists that things have never been better, anyone who points out cracks in the wall is seen as a pessimist or even a traitor. This is why civilizations can race toward collapse while much of the population remains convinced they are still rising. We see hints of this in our own age. Technology dazzles us with breakthroughs. Economies measure health in stock market highs, and political rhetoric proclaims each era as the best of times. And in many ways, we do live in extraordinary comfort and possibility, but the illusion of progress tempts us to ignore the costs: widening inequality, ecological strain, political polarization, and the erosion of shared truth. Nietzsche would have recognized this pattern. He warned against the decadence of cultures that cling to the outward forms of greatness while hollowing out the inner substance. To him, true progress was not in the piling up of luxuries or spectacles, but in the cultivation of strength, creativity, and depth. Without those, the show is just that, a show. The illusion of progress is perhaps the most dangerous phase of idiocracy because it blinds a culture to its own vulnerability. The people mistake motion for direction, expansion for improvement, and novelty for advancement. When reality finally breaks through, often in the form of economic crisis, war, or social upheaval, the shock is devastating. For the individual, this stage carries a quiet warning: beware the temptation to measure your life only by its visible successes. You can build the equivalent of your own personal Colosseum: the career, the possessions, the curated image, while neglecting the deeper structures that sustain you character, relationships, purpose. The outward appearance may hold for a while, but without substance, collapse is inevitable. The antidote, at both the personal and civilizational level, is honesty, not cynicism, but the courage to see clearly, to measure progress, not by how loud we proclaim it, but by how strong our foundations truly are. Because the final irony is this: civilizations often fall at the height of their own celebration. The applause is loudest just before the curtain comes down. History's warnings are rarely subtle, but they are often ignored. We have walked through six patterns that appear again and again in the fall of civilizations: the drift from wisdom to popularity, when leaders chase applause instead of truth; the comfort trap, when prosperity breeds fragility; the death of intellectual elites, when thinkers retreat and opportunists take their place; the noise of the many drowns the voice of the few, when mass opinion silences moral courage; moral inversion, when vice is called virtue, and virtue is mocked; the illusion of progress, when spectacle hides decay. Each on its own can damage a culture. Together they form a slope that no civilization can descend without consequence. And yet, the most sobering truth is that these patterns do not only belong to the pages of history, they are here in our politics, our media, our communities, and perhaps in ourselves. Civilizations do not fall because of abstract forces. They fall because of the choices and silences of millions of individuals. That means the story is never just about them, it is about you. So, what is to be done? We resist the drift from wisdom to popularity by telling the truth, even when it costs us approval. We break the comfort trap by choosing challenge over ease, growth over safety. We guard against the death of intellectual elites by seeking and becoming voices of depth in the public square. We refuse the tyranny of the crowd by standing for conscience, even if we stand alone. We reject moral inversion by living in such a way that our values are not for sale, and we pierce the illusion of progress by measuring our strength not in appearances but in substance. None of this is easy, but nothing worth preserving ever is. The world does not need more spectators, cynics, or passive critics. It needs people willing to hold the line, to carry forward the virtues that keep a civilization alive. People who are not seduced by the bright lights of spectacle, who do not bow to the shallow demands of the crowd, who understand that progress without virtue is a march toward the cliff. If you see these patterns in our time, let that sight be a call, not to despair, but to action. The tide of idiocracy may be strong, but it is not irresistible. Every act of truth, every refusal to bow to corruption, every choice to value depth over noise is a small act of resistance. And these acts, multiplied, are how declines are slowed or even reversed. So I leave you with this question, the same question history asks of every generation: will you be the kind of person who drifts with the crowd, or the kind who quietly, stubbornly stands against it? If this conversation has resonated with you, subscribe and join us. Each week we explore the questions that civilizations forget to ask until it's too late, questions that might just keep the fire alive. And if you have your own thoughts on how to resist the slide into idiocracy, share them below. The discussion matters. The time is now. Because the fall of a civilization begins in the mind of its people, and so does its salvation.